writers of contemporary Christian music. The guy had the name, his name was Chris Christian. How about that? He wrote a song once called "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" We got some back today. Speaking of which, the community that I live in, Paradise Falls, over the hills and road a little bit. We have some year-round residents, and then we get a big influx of people during the summer, and we're in our 95th year now as a Lutheran association. And it's always been the tradition that during the season, in the summer, that we hold worship services there as well. It's always been a great point of unity to even the people that during the winter belong to other, we have people that belong to Scott Run, that belong to Stroudsburg, that we have Scranton, but for the summer then we all worship together. It's kind of fun. Well, we got a new worship chairperson this year, and she decided, even though we've been using that green book all along, it's been around for so long, she decided that we should try to use one of the new liturgies from the new Cranberry hymnal, which I notice isn't in the pews here either. You know, and it isn't in a lot of Lutheran churches yet either, even though it's been around about 7 8 years now. It's great for the hymns, let me tell you that much. Well, of course, you know, the mumbling and the grumbling began among my father, you know, who also lives in our community. He said, "Why can't we just have the old ways?" And the worst of it comes to the Lord's Prayer, because she decided to use the new version of the Lord's Prayer. Well, mumble, mumble, grumble. So I say unfortunately, about the third week in, one of our visiting pastors said, "Pray the prayer however you want to." So now it's just mumbled chaos. And of course, we did have a guy who he just died this year, but he used to pray it in German every year. So change is tough, especially in the church, huh? But the interesting thing is that change happens to us all the time. Maybe that's why, you know, with so much change that always happens in life all the time, some people have always thought that the church is the one place that shouldn't change. I can come here and feel comfortable. How many of you have watched black and white TV this week? How many of you called anybody and dialed their number this week? Change has come, and we've accepted a lot of change, and we kind of like a lot of the changes that have come in our world. But change has also come to the church, and you may have heard, if you've heard some of this before, then hopefully it's reinforcement. If you haven't, maybe it's some learning for you and that kind of thing. But I want to talk to you, begin by talking a little bit about what we call a paradigm shift. What's a paradigm? Well, just so you got it right, I got it from the dictionary, so I can get it right too. A paradigm, one of the working definition I want to use, is a philosophical, a theoretical framework within which theories, laws, and generalizations are formulated. For our sake, I want to talk about the fact that we've been working and living in what you want to call a Christian paradigm. A Christian theoretical world. You and I were raised not only in a church, but at least having the idea that the United States is a Christian nation. As a matter of fact, since the 3rd century, Christianity has been a paradigm with which a majority of the Western world has worked. You may recall that up until that time, Christians were persecuted. Christians were attacked. It was an underground movement, the followers of Jesus. If the knock came on your door and they said, "Confess Caesar as Lord," you had two choices. Deny Jesus and save your life, or confess Christ and possibly lose it in the arena. But then, around the 3rd century, and quite honestly for some political reasons, because the Roman Empire was having some problems, and empires have problems, do they not? It was decided that Christianity should become the religion of the empire. So for the past 1700 some years, the Western world spreading out from the Roman Empire and that sort of thing has kind of lived under this paradigm. That church and society kind of go hand in hand and work with each other, and that they kind of, associate with one another. It was a bold experiment here when the founding people of this nation said that church and state should be separate enough that the church creates good citizens to help the state, but the state can't define what the church thinks and believes. But the churches are free to do that. That was kind of bold as a political experiment. But anybody who's been paying attention can tell that something has changed. Something major has changed. And it hasn't been in the last 5 years or 10 years or 25 years. It's been happening for probably at least a century. There were not very few people caught on to what was happening. And even when it did catch on what was happening, very few people tried to deal with it or talk about it, including the church, even including its seminaries. We've continued to train pastors for a church that doesn't exist anymore. And the seminaries are just now catching on to what they should have done 50 years ago. Because the church has changed, hasn't it? Because the world has changed, hasn't it? And the big thing that we see is people don't think the church is important in their lives anymore. The biggest category in surveys now is nuns. People are writing books about the nuns. N-O-N-E-S. People that have no religious affiliation, though they may still consider themselves to be spiritual. Church I served out in Ohio in the 1970s was the largest Lutheran church in Ohio. And there's lots of Lutherans in Ohio to pick from. 3,500 members in the 70s. When I got there, there were about 750 people left on the rolls, but probably about 400 people that you could identify. By the time we went through a fire and some other transitions, we had about 200 active people. Very active, very mission-oriented, but 200. Where did the others go? Well, there were some conflicts, and some of them once upon a time went to some other churches, but a lot of them just went away. And church just wasn't the thing that they felt they needed to belong to, that they needed for their lives anymore. And that's the major paradigm shift that we have been facing and trying to work our way through. And at least those of us who have been paying attention have been trying to talk about and study and figure out. One of the church leaders who was working on this for a good long time went to a conference where they were going to talk about this. I mean, that was the stated purpose of the conference. The people knew who he was and why he was coming. So when he got there, there were 200 people that all were wearing T-shirts that said, "Shift happens."
Thank you.
It does. And the reality is you can deny it all you want, but the thing is it has happened. I mean, it's still happening in some way, but the reality is that it has happened. And the greatest deniers of it have been the church. Why can't it just be the way it was? If we could just only bring back 1958, or 48 or 38, whatever you consider to be the high point, right? But we can't bring that back. We don't have way-back machines to do that. But we do have a future. We have to kind of try to figure out what that is. And the problem is that, you can do two things when you start to recognize that this is happening. You can withdraw from the world and set up your camp, set up your cult, set up your club, and keep doing what you were doing. And unless the club members keep having more members, the last Lutheran immigration happened in this country in the late 1800s. And Lutherans aren't birthing as many Lutherans as they used to. So how are you going to get more people to become a Lutheran member of the church? They're not immigrating and they're not being born. Guess what? You're going to have to go meet some people. You're going to have to be in contact with the world. And when we start to understand that, when we start to let that reality be our reality, guess what happens? We get scared. We get anxious. We get afraid. We're kind of afraid of losing what we had. And there's some people that are afraid that if we throw out the bathwater, we're going to throw out the baby with it. And the church for many, many years now has been trying all kinds of tricks of the trade and all kinds of programs that have gone down the pipe to tell us what's happening. But the reality is that where churches are thriving and growing in the midst of this paradigm shift is because they are radically centered in mission. They know who they are, they know whose they are, and they know what they should be about. And it ain't about being a club. They know what they should be about. And that's where I think today's gospel lesson can help us a little bit. And if you noticed, all three lessons have something to say about not being afraid, even if you're the last one standing, like Elijah, to speak the word of the Lord, to go out and share the word of the Lord. Today's gospel reading, and this really, you're going to start to hear this now in the gospel lessons because we're reading from Matthew, and this is a place where it starts to pick up now, where Jesus is going to speak more and more and more about the community. In fact, Jesus will even, at least in Matthew's Jesus, will even use the word church, which Jesus wouldn't have used because there wasn't anything like the church. So we kind of know Matthew's got a point to make about why he's sharing some of these Jesus stories with us. This story comes in the context of, go back a little bit, John the Baptist has just been killed by Herod. Because John the Baptist was preaching against the leader. That's dangerous these days, isn't it? He was preaching against behaviors of the leader which were obviously out of line, but nobody was calling it out except John. And Herod finally has enough of it and has him put to death. And that's where we find Jesus then wanting to escape for a moment to consider this, because this is his cousin. This is his co-worker in the spreading of the word of God. Grab his feelings for a minute and understand why he wanted to retreat and get away and just think about this for a minute. Maybe think about what he was actually doing and whether he wanted to continue doing it. But he can't escape. And the crowds follow him, and we end up with this big mob that comes and listens to him teach, and then the miraculous feeding of them all. And finally, he's able to dismiss them all off again. And at the beginning of our gospel today, he's back off, gets his moments of quiet. It's important to note, there's all kinds of fun things in this text, that at the beginning of this chapter, after Herod had taken care of John and got rid of him, and all of a sudden, Jesus appears, and Herod's actually afraid that this is John the Baptist's ghost. That's important to know when, a couple verses later, the disciples think they see a ghost out on the water. But we come to this wonderful scene now where the disciples have gone ahead. They get into the midst of a storm, and lo and behold, here comes Jesus walking on the water toward them. Have you heard this? That there's a platform over on the Sea of Galilee now, a plexiglass platform that you can walk out on so you can walk on the water. Anything for a buck, tourist mark, right? Jesus comes walking toward them. They're panicking, they're afraid, it's chaos. We think they may be going down. Jesus comes and says, don't be afraid. It is I. Or, as the actual Greek words say, ego eimi, which is the unspeakable name of God. I am. Do not be afraid. God. Huh? Do not be afraid. God. God is here. God is with you. At which point, then, Peter, and he's really acting as a representative of all the disciples here, Peter says, I'd like to do that too. And Jesus says, well, then come on. And Peter steps out of the boat. You know, we don't get any scientific explanations here of how you walk on waves that are crashing and everything, but Peter gets out of the boat and starts walking toward Jesus. Then, as the story says, he loses focus. He starts to look around. And he becomes involved with the chaos again. And when he becomes involved with the chaos, what happens? Down he goes. At which point he cries out, Lord, save me. And again, if you don't think you're thinking about the church here, go back to what the words are. Kyrie eleison. Whoever has sung those words or sung those words, Lord, have mercy. Here's Peter representing the whole church in the midst of chaos, crying out, Lord, have mercy. Lord, save us. Because in Matthew's time, it was chaos. The early church really didn't know what to make of this situation. The Lord had sent them out on this mission, but the world was rejecting them and the word and the mission. And as a matter of fact, persecuting them for it. It was a world of chaos. What do you believe? What are you supposed to think about all this at this point? Where are you supposed to place your trust? I am. And that's all we're given. I am. God. Trust me. Don't be afraid. So do you see how this lesson can help the church of today? And how it can help St. Paul's in a chaotic time of transition? What if we don't get an interim pastor for 6 months? What if we don't get a pastor for 2 years? God. Boom. Then you have to deal with that for yourself and wrestle with that. The point, of course, is where is our focus? If our focus is on the chaos, there's a good chance focus is on Jesus, the one who's calling, come, get out of the boat. Get out of the old paradigm. Become part of the shift. Work with us here. Then we know where the future is. And though we may hit bumps and rocky things and waves, we've got a chance of being what God wants us to really be in the world. I have to admit, I intentionally kind of stayed away from your process of, I'm trying to keep my nose out of it. Because pastors can be nosy, bossy guys, And don't remember here, you need to be able to do your future. Got a question? I'll try to answer. But you've started to do some surveys, some things about yourself, talking about yourself. You're starting to look for a person who might be a part of your mission as you go forward. But that's the whole point. You're not looking for a person to come and take care of the club. You're coming and looking for a person who has some gifts that will be able to enable your gifts so that we can keep our focus on Jesus and keep moving. And I think I said this a month ago. I kind of figure that's the basic job of a pastor, keeping the congregation's focus on Jesus. You can do everything else. As a matter of fact, some of you can also do that. But I think that's what pastors are set apart by the church to do. Help the church remember the story. Keep the focus on Jesus. Keep the eyes ahead so we know where we're going. Some of you have probably heard of a guy named Rick Warren. He's done Bible studies in 40 days kinds of things, studies and that kind of stuff. He wrote a wonderful little statement once. He said, our job is not to figure out how to create the waves. Our job is to learn how to surf. Because that's what's happening in the world. So change is happening. It will continue to happen. And, doing things that might in some ways attract people. But remember, mission is not about if we build it, they will come. There are some things that work that way. Mission is going to be becoming to figure out more and more and more who the community is, what needs they have that Jesus has the answer to. The Pastor Harry Wendt, who's written a wonderful Bible study that's used all around the world. I love what Harry's done in Bible study, but he started his whole process of doing that as he was new in the ministry by talking to people, who would say to him, "Oh, I don't believe in God." And he would say to them, "Well, tell me about that God you don't believe in." And then they would, And then he would say to them, "Well, I don't believe in that God either. Can I tell you about God that I believe in?" And that may be our job as well. The church has hurt some people along the way, and they've left and gone away and said, "I don't need the church anymore." Or maybe the church hasn't been dynamic enough for people who are even spiritual and looking for something a little bit more dynamic. We've got all kinds of opportunities lying ahead of us in the days and months and years to come. All you need to remember is, do not fear. I am, and I am with you. That's Matthew's bookends, as a matter of fact. At the beginning, his name will be Emmanuel, God with us. At the end, I am with you always. Let the people of God say,